NCIS quietly revives Gibbs' best story ahead of Mark Harmon's return. For more than 2 decades, NCIS has built its identity around unforgettable cases, complicated family dynamics, and characters whose personal histories are often just as compelling as the crimes they investigate. Few characters embody that tradition more completely than Leroy Jethro Gibbs. Now, with Mark Harmon's anticipated return connected to NCIS, Origins, the franchise appears to be quietly revisiting one of Gibbs' most important storytelling elements, and it could be the perfect setup for his comeback. Gibbs was never simply the stern leader of the major case response team. Beneath his quiet personality was a deeply complicated man shaped by loss, military service, failed relationships, and years of carrying emotional wounds that he rarely allowed anyone to see. His past frequently influenced the way he handled cases, especially when a new investigation reminded him of something he had tried to leave behind. That is what made Gibbs' best storylines so effective. They did not merely reveal information about him. They explained why he became the person viewers knew. Gibbs' past has always been one of NCIS's greatest assets. One of the strongest aspects of Gibbs' character was the gradual revelation of his history. Rather than explaining everything at once, NCIS allowed viewers to discover pieces of his life over many seasons. His relationship with Shannon and Kelly was especially important. The tragedy surrounding their deaths became one of the defining events of Gibbs' life, influencing his attitude toward justice, family, loyalty, and violence. Even when those events were not directly mentioned, their emotional impact remained visible. The series also explored Gibbs' marriages, his military background, his relationship with his father, and the people he lost along the way. Each storyline added another layer to the character. This approach created a fascinating contradiction. Gibbs often appeared emotionally controlled, but viewers knew that his silence was not emptiness. It was usually the result of having experienced more than he was willing to discuss. That is precisely why revisiting his past can still work. The franchise may be returning to a familiar formula. The arrival of NCIS, Origins already represents a major return to Gibbs' history because the series explores the younger version of the character. Instead of presenting Gibbs as the experienced team leader audiences knew for years, the prequel gives the franchise an opportunity to examine how that man was created. That opens the door for something particularly interesting, connecting Gibbs' past with his present. Rather than simply telling another story about young Gibbs, the franchise can use his history to provide context for the older character. A decision made decades earlier can suddenly take on new meaning when viewers understand what Gibbs was thinking at the time. This kind of storytelling has always been one of NCIS's strengths. Mark Harmon's presence makes the timing more significant. Mark Harmon's connection to Gibbs is so strong that even a limited return can have enormous emotional weight. For years, Harmon defined Gibbs through subtle performances rather than dramatic speeches. A glance, a pause, or a quiet reaction could communicate more than an entire conversation. Because of that, bringing him back does not necessarily require Gibbs to dominate an entire storyline. His appearance could instead serve as the emotional bridge between different eras of the franchise. That possibility makes the current focus on Gibbs' history particularly intriguing. If the story is intentionally revisiting themes associated with his younger years, Harmon's return could feel less like a cameo and more like the conclusion of a larger character journey. Why Gibbs' family story still matters among Gibbs' many storylines. His family remains one of the richest sources of emotional material. Gibbs' relationship with his father Jackson gave viewers a rare opportunity to see him outside the professional environment. Around his father, Gibbs could become quieter, more vulnerable, and occasionally even playful. Those moments helped prove that the man who commanded respect at NCIS headquarters was not the entire person. His relationship with Shannon and Kelly went even deeper. Their deaths became a permanent part of his identity, and the franchise repeatedly returned to the idea that Gibbs' greatest strength and greatest weakness were connected to the people he loved. That history can still influence stories today. A modern case involving family, loss, revenge, or unresolved trauma could easily bring Gibbs' old emotional conflicts back into focus, without simply repeating earlier episodes. The best version of Gibbs was always personal. Some of the most memorable Gibbs stories were not necessarily the biggest action episodes. They were the ones that forced him to confront something personal. When an investigation reminded Gibbs of someone he had lost, his behavior changed. His normally controlled personality became more intense, and his sense of justice could become almost obsessive. That was when the audience understood him best. The franchise could benefit enormously from returning to that approach. Instead of making Gibbs's return solely about nostalgia, a new storyline could give him another emotional challenge that connects directly to his past. It would allow Mark Harmon to play the character audiences remember while still giving the story something new to say. A return does not have to erase Gibbs' ending. One potential concern with bringing Gibbs back is that his departure from the main series gave the character something rare: peace. After years of tragedy and responsibility, Gibbs finally walked away from the relentless pace of NCIS life. He found a quieter existence and began embracing a different way of living. A return should not undo that development. In fact, the opposite could make the story more powerful. An older Gibbs, who has found some degree of peace, could confront his past from a completely different perspective. He would not necessarily be the same man who once responded to every threat with immediate force. He could be wiser, calmer, and more willing to acknowledge the emotions he once buried. That would give Mark Harmon an opportunity to portray a Gibbs who has evolved without losing the qualities that made him iconic. The franchise has a chance to complete the circle. The most exciting possibility is that NCIS could use Gibbs' history to connect its past, present, and future. NCIS Origins explores where Gibbs came from. The main NCIS series established the legendary team leader he eventually became. A future appearance by Harmon could show what all those experiences ultimately created. That is a much more meaningful approach than simply bringing Gibbs back because fans miss him. It would make his return part of the franchise's larger mythology. Gibbs has always been a character defined by what happened to him. Every loss, every relationship, every case, and every difficult decision helped shape him. Revisiting those stories now could remind audiences why he became one of television's most recognizable crime drama characters in the first place. The quiet revival could become a major story. The most interesting part of this development is that it does not need to be loud. NCIS has never required massive announcements to make Gibbs' history important. Sometimes a single reference, familiar location, old photograph, or emotional conversation is enough to bring his entire past rushing back. If the franchise is intentionally reviving elements of Gibbs' strongest storyline before Mark Harmon's return, it could be laying the groundwork for something much bigger. The key will be respecting what came before. Gibbs does not need another tragedy simply to create drama. He does not need to become the old Gibbs again. What he needs is a story that recognizes everything he has experienced and allows that history to matter. That is where a potential Mark Harmon return becomes especially exciting. After years of watching Gibbs carry the weight of his past, audiences could finally see what happens when he confronts that past as a man who has already survived it. And if NCIS gets that balance right, Gibbs' return could be more than a nostalgic reunion. It could become one of the franchise's most emotionally satisfying chapters yet. NCIS quietly revives Gibbs' best story ahead of Mark Harmon's return Part 2. There is another reason Gibbs' return could become more meaningful than a simple appearance. The character's history gives NCIS an opportunity to explore something the franchise has rarely been able to show for long: the man Gibbs became after leaving the job. For years, Gibbs' identity was inseparable from NCIS. The badge, the team, the rules, and the responsibility were all part of his daily life. Even when he attempted to step away, circumstances repeatedly pulled him back. But his departure created an intriguing question. Who is Gibbs when he is no longer responsible for everyone else? That question could become the emotional foundation of a new storyline. The Gibbs we could see next may be different if Mark Harmon returns. Audiences may not be looking at exactly the same Gibbs they remember from the main series. That would be a good thing. Gibbs spent much of his life believing that responsibility meant protecting everyone around him. He rarely allowed himself to become vulnerable because he viewed emotional control as another form of strength. Age and experience, however, can change a person. A future Gibbs could finally understand that protecting people does not always mean standing between them and danger. Sometimes it means trusting them to make their own decisions. That would create an interesting contrast with the younger Gibbs seen in NCIS. Origins. The younger version is still learning how to deal with grief, anger, loyalty, and authority. The older Gibbs has already lived through those lessons. Putting those two versions of the character in conversation, even indirectly, could create one of the franchise's strongest themes. His greatest story was never really about revenge. Gibbs' history is filled with moments when revenge appeared to be the obvious answer. But the most compelling stories often questioned whether revenge actually gave him what he wanted. His past taught him to distrust easy answers. That is why his strongest emotional arcs were not simply about catching criminals. They were about whether justice could truly repair what had been broken. That distinction matters. A younger Gibbs might believe that finding the person responsible is enough. An older Gibbs may understand that justice cannot bring back the people he lost. That evolution gives the character enormous dramatic potential. Instead of repeating the same revenge narrative, NCIS can revisit the theme from a more mature perspective. The franchise could use Gibbs as a link between generations. One of the biggest advantages of the current NCIS universe is its expanding timeline. The franchise now has the ability to tell stories about characters at different stages of their lives while keeping them connected through shared history. Gibbs is arguably the perfect character to serve as that bridge. His younger years can be explored through NCIS Origins, while his legacy continues to influence the world of the modern franchise. That means Gibbs does not necessarily need to appear constantly. His presence can be felt through people he trained, decisions he made, cases he solved, and lessons he left behind. If Harmon appears again, that existing legacy could suddenly become personal. Gibbs's old team could make the return even more emotional. Another powerful possibility involves the people Gibbs left behind. The MCRT was never simply a workplace for Gibbs. Over the years, the team became something resembling a family. That makes his departure emotionally complicated. Even if Gibbs has found peace, the people he mentored may still carry parts of him with them. His methods, sayings, instincts, and lessons became part of how they approached investigations. A return could therefore explore an important question. What does Gibbs think of the team he created now that he is no longer leading it? The answer could be surprisingly emotional. Perhaps he would recognize that the team no longer needs him in the way it once did. For a man whose identity was built around being needed, accepting that reality could be one of his hardest challenges. Mark Harmon does not need a full-time return. There is also a practical reason. A limited Gibbs appearance could work so well. The franchise does not need to completely rebuild itself around Gibbs. His return could be carefully contained within a storyline that gives the character emotional significance without overshadowing the newer generation. That balance would allow NCIS to honor its history while continuing to move forward. In fact, limited appearances could make Gibbs feel more special. If audiences know that every appearance matters, a single conversation or unexpected reunion could carry enormous emotional weight. The best surprise could be a quiet one. Modern television often treats major returns as enormous events, but Gibbs has always been better suited to something quieter. Imagine a storyline that spends several episodes building around an old case, a forgotten name, or a mystery from Gibbs's past. The audience slowly realizes that the investigation is connected to something much bigger. Then, Gibbs appears. No enormous speech, no exaggerated entrance, just Gibbs standing there, watching the situation unfold, with the same unmistakable expression fans have known for years. That kind of moment would be completely consistent with the character, and it could be far more effective than a conventional blockbuster return. His legacy may be more important than his screen time. Ultimately, the most important part of Gibbs's potential return is not how many episodes Mark Harmon appears in. It is what the character represents. Gibbs represents the history of NCIS. He represents the franchise's earliest identity, its most complicated emotional stories, and the philosophy that shaped generations of characters. By quietly reviving one of his best storylines, the franchise can remind audiences why Gibbs mattered without turning the clock backward. The younger Gibbs can continue discovering himself. The modern characters can continue building their own identities. And the older Gibbs can exist somewhere between those worlds, a living reminder of everything the franchise has survived. That could make his return feel less like a revival and more like a continuation. After all, Gibbs's greatest story was never simply about becoming an NCIS agent. It was about surviving everything that happened afterward. If NCIS is preparing to revisit that story before Mark Harmon's return, the franchise may be setting up something far more emotional than fans initially realize. And when Gibbs finally steps back into the NCIS universe, the biggest question may not be whether he still belongs there. It may be whether the world he left behind is finally ready to understand the man he became. NCIS quietly revives Gibbs' best story ahead of Mark Harmon's return Part 3. The deeper NCIS goes into Gibbs' history, the clearer one thing becomes. His greatest stories were never really about the badge. They were about identity. Gibbs spent decades becoming the person everyone expected him to be. He was the leader who had the answer, the investigator who could read a suspect in seconds, and the mentor who could recognize danger before anyone else noticed it. But beneath all of that was a man who spent much of his life trying to understand what he had lost. That makes the timing of a potential Mark Harmon return particularly interesting. Gibbs' oldest wounds could become his newest story. One of the smartest ways to revisit Gibbs would be to introduce a case that appears unrelated to his past. At first, it could look like a standard investigation. Then a familiar detail emerges. A name, a location, an old photograph, a piece of evidence that reminds Gibbs of a case he thought he had buried forever. Suddenly, the investigation becomes personal. But the important difference would be Gibbs' reaction. The younger man might have responded with anger. The older Gibbs could respond with restraint. That contrast would show how much he has changed. The Gibbs who left NCIS was finally learning to let go. Gibbs' departure was significant because it represented something he had struggled with for years: letting go. He had spent most of his life believing that walking away meant abandoning people. Eventually, he realized that staying was not always the same thing as living. That realization could become central to his next story. If he returns, perhaps it is not because he has been dragged back into the world he escaped. Perhaps he returns because he chooses to. That distinction would completely change the meaning of his appearance. Gibbs would not be returning because he cannot live without NCIS. He would be returning because something genuinely matters to him. A new mystery could force Gibbs to reconsider his past. The franchise could also use Gibbs' history to create a mystery that spans generations. Imagine a case connected to an investigation from the early years of his career. The original evidence may have been incomplete. A witness may have disappeared, or an old decision may suddenly become relevant. The current NCIS team would investigate the present-day circumstances. Meanwhile, Gibbs would remember what actually happened decades earlier. That structure would allow NCIS to tell two stories at once. One would explore the current mystery. The other would reveal a missing chapter of Gibbs' past. It would be a natural way to connect the modern franchise with NCIS. Origins without making either show dependent on the other. The emotional payoff could come from Gibbs family. Gibbs family history remains one of the strongest emotional foundations available to the franchise. His father, his first wife, his daughter, and the relationships he built afterward all contributed to the complicated way he viewed family. For much of his life, Gibbs treated family as something precious but dangerous. Loving someone meant giving the world another way to hurt him. That philosophy explained many of his choices. A future storyline could challenge it. Perhaps Gibbs encounters someone who reminds him of the family he lost, not literally, but emotionally. Someone who needs guidance. Someone who is making the same mistakes he once made. For the first time, Gibbs might be able to offer advice without trying to control the outcome. That would be genuine character growth. The younger and older Gibbs could tell the same story differently. This is where NCIS Origins becomes especially valuable. A younger Gibbs gives the audience the opportunity to see his instincts before they became legendary. An older Gibbs can show what those instincts cost him. The two versions together create a complete character portrait. The younger Gibbs is still becoming the man viewers recognize. The older Gibbs knows exactly who he is and has finally stopped running from it. That contrast could turn a simple franchise crossover into something much more meaningful. Instead of relying on nostalgia, the story would explore how people change while carrying the same memories. Gibbs' return could also test his relationship with leadership. For decades, Gibbs believed leadership meant being responsible for every outcome. That belief made him an exceptional investigator, but also placed enormous emotional pressure on him. A return could finally challenge that philosophy. What happens when Gibbs realizes someone else has become the leader? Would he interfere? Would he offer advice? Or would he simply observe? The most powerful answer might be the last one. Gibbs, sitting quietly in the background while another generation makes decisions, could demonstrate just how far he has come. He would not need to prove that he is still the smartest person in the room. He would simply know that he does not have to be. Why fans could respond so strongly? The emotional appeal of Gibbs has always come from recognition. Fans recognize the quiet moments, the stubbornness, the loyalty, the reluctance to talk about feelings, the tendency to protect others while ignoring himself. Those qualities made Gibbs feel less like a traditional television hero and more like someone who had learned to survive by keeping his emotions under control. A return that respects those qualities could resonate far more deeply than a story built around explosions or massive action sequences. Fans do not necessarily need Gibbs to save everyone again. They may simply want to see him, and more importantly, They may want to see what all those years of experience have done to him. The franchise is in a unique position. Few television franchises have the opportunity to explore one character across multiple decades. NCIS does. That makes Gibbs unusually valuable. The franchise can show him as a young investigator, an established team leader, and an older man who has finally stepped away from the job. Each version can reveal something different. Together, they create a story about time. That could become one of the most compelling themes surrounding Mark Harmon's return. Gibbs is not simply coming back to repeat the past. He is coming back as someone who survived it. The real question is what Gibbs wants now. For years, viewers knew what Gibbs wanted: justice, answers, protection for his team. Eventually, he wanted peace. But what does Gibbs want now? That unanswered question may be the key to making his return worthwhile. If the writers can answer it honestly, they can create a storyline that feels fresh while remaining faithful to everything that came before. Maybe Gibbs wants to help one final person. Maybe he wants to settle an old score without becoming the man he used to be. Maybe he simply wants to make sure that a mistake from his past does not become someone else's future. Whatever the answer is, it should come from the character, not from the need to manufacture another dramatic twist. Gibbs' best story may still have one chapter left. The most exciting possibility is that Gibbs' story was never completely finished. His departure gave him peace, but peace does not mean there are no unresolved questions. Sometimes the most interesting stories begin after the character believes the journey is over. That is where Gibbs could be now. Older, more reflective, less angry, but still capable of stepping into a difficult situation when someone needs him. If NCIS is quietly reviving one of Gibbs' strongest storylines ahead of Mark Harmon's return, it may be preparing to show audiences something they have never fully seen before. Not the Gibbs who became a legend, not the Gibbs who spent decades carrying everyone else, but the Gibbs who finally understands that his own story matters too, and when he eventually appears again, that may be the most powerful reason for fans to watch. Because after everything Gibbs has given to NCIS, the franchise now has an opportunity to give something back to him. A final chapter worthy of the character who helped build the entire universe.